Welcome to Poets House live streaming. My name is Paulo Javier, Poet and Program Director of Poets House, broadcasting this evening from Lenape-Haking, specifically the unceded territory of the Rockaway, Canarsie, and Matinacock peoples, otherwise known as Queens County, New York City. We are less than a month away from the 2020 elections, one of the most urgent and decisive elections that this country, and perhaps the world, has seen in decades. To discuss the intersections of poetry, electoral politics, and civic duty, I will be joined tonight by three leading poet activists: Patricia Spears Jones, founder of the American Poets Congress; Joey De Jesus, candidate for New York Assembly District 38; and our first presenter is Bryan Thao Worra. Bryan is a Lao Minnesotan Poet Laureate and holds a Joyce Award, an NEA Fellowship in Literature, and over 20 other distinctions for their creative writing. Their current book of poetry is Before We Remember, We Dream from Satu Press. Bryan, it's good to have you back to Poets House. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for inviting us back here. And I am so excited to see everyone gathered together for this important and momentous conversation on what it means to be a poet in the modern age, and how can we engage poetics and politics at the same time, because that's an issue that many people challenge, we find, even today. The question of what is the role of poets in civics is a question that has preoccupied me personally, as my community observes a very significant anniversary this year of 45 years in diaspora since the end of the Vietnam War. And as Lao refugees, much of our stories has been unheard and untold within the community, except through the forms of poetry. And we find ourselves making this transition, this pivot from classic monarchy into a democracy after 700 years. And what we look at in our conversations is this question that our historic role in our culture was to be the eyes of the city, that often we were expected to be the unflinching observers and at times advocates for those who were in power, and as well as the ordinary people. But that role has often changed. And I think it's interesting for us to note that in this journey, we were often anonymous figures, which was a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, our verse and our creations then could come to the community without fear or favor, as the classic notations go. And yet at the same time, what does it mean when we as poets take an individual and a personal stand about what we believe in and where we feel our community should go? And what does it mean to advocate for that? Growing up as a poet, I found myself often looking to the fates of other poets, both imagined and historical, as a point where I was trying to understand what it would mean for me to be a part of that community. I think I often remember the old classic play by William Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, and we all remember those classic scenes, of course, like Friends, Romans, Lend Me Your Ears, and so on. But there was a throwaway scene in that play that always kind of struck me, where the incensed mob is chasing down all the different people that they believed were responsible for for the death of Caesar. And at one point, they corner this poor fellow, then thinking that he's son of a senator, and he's shouting, "No, no, no! I'm son of a poet. I'm son of a poet." And the crowd then proceeds to shout, "Well, then kill him for his bad verses. Kill him for his bad verses." And I find myself saying, "Whoa, is that what happens when we are doing that?" But it's like you look around internationally, you see the journey of the Tang Dynasty poets, then Du Fu, Li Bai, so many others, then where they fell in and out of favor as they're creating their verse. Sometimes it's taken to be deeply political, deeply historical, and that's challenging to those in power. And what does it mean for the people if the poets aren't speaking for them? You look at the early 20th century with a poet like Robinson Jeffers, for example, who was largely ignored and almost blacklisted for his anti-war positions. I look at the lives of someone like Ezra Pound or Pablo Neruda, who let's see, their politics were incredibly terrible, even as oftentimes we look at their verse today, and we still find much to admire. I have to admit that I often look back at Ezra Pound's classic quote that poetry is news that stays news, and I wondered what that could mean for us. And then you also had the work of poets like Otto Rene Castillo, who tried to engage in politics through his verse. His poem Apolitical Intellectuals was deeply influential to me, but I also can't turn a blind eye to the fact that, in the end, he was captured by his enemies and set on fire. And yet, that verse continues. It resonates into the present day. I suppose what I'm moving us towards is this idea that poets and politics can't be taken for granted. And I think the question is, what does it mean for us to make that step forward, to engage with one another meaningfully? And that, as we struggle in a modern age, then to kind of feel that we have this relationship. I'm centered out of Minneapolis, Ben, and that's a city where poets have converged for decades, Ben, trying to bring our issues together. And it has been a challenging one as we see cases such as the case of George Floyd is the one that most recently comes to mind, but there's so many others. The case of Phong Ni, a young Hmong refugee who was killed by the police. And as poets, we ask ourselves, where's the justice? Where do we add our voice to that? The conversation has always considered where we are, particularly as new Americans, in making this journey, and what do we express? What do we dare express? I find myself saying that for my students, that we have to write to the limits of our imagination, and that we also have to ask ourselves, how do we keep coming to the table even when we express these ideas and it can often feel like we're unheard and that there's no space for our voice and our narrative? How do we keep pushing forward with that? And what brings us back to the table? I think it's important that we understand that in times like these, it is so important for us to continue to bring hope to other communities, to make certain that if nothing else, as we are writing to the limits of our imagination and as we are writing to the limits of our memory, that we remember our role as witness and to imagine, to challenge and to confirm. Because there may come a time that we don't have the same ease with which we can express ourselves. And I would hurt very much for any of our community members to find themselves in a spot where, as they're looking back to this next generation of poets, that they don't actually have an ability to look at our writing and say, one day, you had the ability to write so fully, so freely about politics, about the civic life, about justice, and you did not. And now we don't have that right. No. What would you say to that? So I don't know. I'm going to take a point of reading an example from my newest book, Before We Remember, We Dream, to kind of illustrate how that kind of works in practice. And then I'm very happy to turn it over to the rest of my esteemed colleagues here tonight. So this is a poem called Interesting Times. John, my teacher, pulled me aside one saffron moment after the chanting with a secret he wanted to share, like a war in the tropics. If Americans visit Laos, they'll never be president. Just ask Hubert Humphrey, Hillary Clinton, Ross Perot, David Duke, and John Kerry. My memory is fuzzy, but I also suspect John McCain. Obama was already president when he went, so that doesn't count, but we can watch to see what legacy remains. It won't necessarily be emails or Benghazi, swift boats, or an obscure faux pas over flyover country like the Motor City. But the ghosts of Lanchan have a habit of doing in even your most elaborate political machinations. That's a weird way to dissuade tourists and sexpats. We do what we can against corruption and extinction, fallen skies, and blind ambition. He asked me to explain Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, a tattered copy someone left behind a lifetime ago. We all might as well have been east of Eden. This next poem of mine is an example called Searchin', and it drew quite a bit of controversy when I originally debuted it, but it is based off of some true stories. Searchin'. Helping an old Vietnamese veteran in '97 apply for citizenship in DC, he returned to me distraught over failing one question. Who makes the laws in America? Well, the answer is Congress, I noted. What did you say? Corporations? I didn't know what to reply and took him for fur down the street from my office by DuPont Circle. It probably wasn't the comfort he needed, any more than that autumn night the Hmong soldiers of Missoula wanted me to inspire their children, until I told them I was a poet. We went to slay some emus on the Mua Ranch instead. A Cambodian poet I knew, trained to be a UN diplomat, survived the killing fields, became a bit of a Casanova, had a lovely book of poetry printed in Minnesota. They asked him to leave out the bits where the forest spirit saved him from the Khmer Rouge because it made him sound foolish. A few two-faced Januaries ago, the Trump campaign came calling at the Lao American Center, seeking souls who'd vote for him. We were certain their team misread the instructions to recruit Latino voters as they stood confusedly in a room full of Laotians. But it wasn't so long past the Apple Store suggested we might as well be looking for Martians than any app that knew where Vientiane was. Still, I have no regrets for asking. As refugees, if you can't start somewhere looking for home, you might as well be some sad ghost on the prairie searching for dirty laundry in winter. But I'll leave it at that, and I thank you all for your time.
Thanks so much for that, Bryan. I look forward to engaging with the conversation after. Our next presenter is a much beloved poet and a longtime friend of Poets House. She is the recipient of the 2017 Jackson Poetry Prize from Poets and Writers and the author of A Lucent Fire, New and Selected Poems, and 3 other collections and 5 chapbooks. She co-edited Ordinary Women, an anthology of New York City women poets, and edited Think, Poems for Aretha Franklin's Inauguration Day hat. Patricia is Emeritus Fellow for Black Earth Institute and the organizer of the American Poets Congress. I am so pleased to be welcoming Patricia Spears Jones back to Poets House.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paolo. And I want to just say a couple of things. One is, thank you, Bryan. I think that was really a powerful dissemination of some of the issues that all poets face in terms of looking at their position in the civic life of this or any nation, and also what does it mean actually to be engaged within that. I've been looking at a number of writings that I've been making over the last 3 or 4 years, and I realized that the word peril comes up a great deal. And I didn't even sort of notice that until I went like, wow, the last thing I wrote was, we were in peril. And COVID-19 sort of made that, the pandemic made that very present in this world. I come from a family that's been in this nation for, I guess, 7 generations now. So, and I am extremely interested in the ways in which the American ideal meets the American horror of racism, and what that does to all of us in civic life. It certainly continues to imperil Black people specifically, and people of color generally, but it imperils all of us because it allows for a certain kind of what once was called the invisible ideology, which is white supremacy, to kind of be allowed to be used as the rationale for all kinds of behaviors and misbehaviors, and how in this country. American poets have, in different kinds of ways, tried to deal with that, and from in all kinds of ways. Sometimes usefully, sometimes not so much. There was extraordinary amount of agitation during the Vietnam War. Robert Bly, Adrienne Rich, all kinds of people came out of the woodwork to really engage in that. Here in New York City, we had the power of extraordinary cohort of poets, June Jordan, Sekou Sundiata, Audre Lorde in the 60s and 70s and throughout the rest of their lives. And then I came here in the 70s, and there was still a lot of work going on. The work continues, and I think the most difficult thing for all of us is to realize that the results will not be immediate for what we would like to see happen. And if there's one thing that poets can bring to the table is the power to not only step into the engagement but to step away from it and to see what else is also there and bring it back in. I think that is a very, very difficult space for a lot of younger poets and a lot who want to talk about, how terrible things are all the time. But we also have to think about what is it that we really do want to happen in this country. Saying dismantling systemic racism sounds absolutely amazing. How doable is that? What does that mean? And I think one of the things it means is to indeed start to create some different kinds of ideologies and different kinds of mythologies, because so much of who we are and how we carry ourselves in the world has to do with that. And poets have reinforced or disrupted those narratives, those ideologies in different kinds of ways. So that if you, as Veronica Golos did a few years ago, write about, say, the wife of John Brown. Well, who was she? And what did she put up with? And was she deeply connected to his mission? Indeed, she was. Or you find ways in which to truly uh, uh, explore the misbehaviors, um, and also how people actually got past them in many ways. One of the great things about Tayamba Jess's Olio is two of the characters if I remember correctly, they were enslaved. Obviously, they were their bonds were removed because of abolition. They were able to purchase the plantation where they had been enslaved. So those are some of the kinds of stories that come out, along with the ones that are really horrific. And we have to really kind of remember that. This is just a bit of writing that I did about organizing the American Poets Congress. I wanted to help work with poets to start to think about, what do we do in language to make these new mythologies? What do we do in language to explore what American really means? Because we are right now in an election that is basically demanding that people sort of declare what kind of American they are and whose America is going to win out. I hope it will be my version of it and not the current one that is being put before us and is allowing people to be slaughtered. So we have a whole lot of work to do as poets to uh, be engaged as citizens in this country or any other country in the world, but also to explore in language what we can do to expand the idea of how humans work together, build together, find ways to congregate together, to be able to listen and learn from each other, and to be able to respect each other. Issues around gender, issues around race, issues around income inequality have so much to do with what people's belief systems are. And we as poets can, in our language, I think, find ways to discuss that belief and to critique it. Here's a poem that I wrote a long time ago. This, I often say I don't write political poems, but I do write poems with lots of politics in it. And here is my Matthew Shepard poem, which to this day I'm amazed that I was able to meet Matthew Shepard's parents at the book launch for this. My Matthew Shepard poem. My students are rightfully spooked. Someone their age was left to perish because he preferred the company of men. My mother tells me of seeing a man lynched back in the 30s in Arkansas, not far from where I grew up and grew away in the 60s. What I know about America is that hatred crawls through the culture like the cracks in the San Andreas fault. Edifices are built to withstand the inevitable quakes, but the quakes grow stronger. Whatever we dream harmony or a reasonable tolerance is destroyed in the wake of men drinking and killing, their blood-lusted laughter howling through the night. A black man in Texas, a white woman in Wyoming, a doctor at his window about to eat dinner with his family, a nurse on her way to work at a clinic. The playing field is not level. In fact, there is no playing field. There are men enraged by change and women bitter about it. And people say gay, black, Latino, Chinese, Japanese, Arab, or Jewish to blame, always to blame. The men in their same wool suits and striped ties gibber political correctness, freedom, fairness, and fuck you every time they claim that these are acts of individuals, not of society. Each act alone represents singular aberrant behavior, like murder. I can hear them say, I mean, they actually lynched that boy, even as they called this one faggot and that one nigger, and they really, really want women compliant and girlish or sexless and mothering. And if this seems like male bashing, so be it. If the dress shoe fits, may it pinch like hell. And that was one way to look at it. The other is this Freedom Tower. What we make of this desire to rebuild quickly, dully over graveyards, yes, this is a graveyard, and wherever we walk, someone passed by storm or anger. Graveyard. This land is a huge graveyard, and yet here is Tower in the making as if grief could be stopped with lights, jackhammers, and pylons. When the earth shakes lower Manhattan, bones will rise up out of their deep sleep seeking names, the way their loved ones sought them. Papered hospital walls, lamp posts, fences, now gone from. But here and there in the air, a smell of loss that mediated the serene skies as the man-made crater quickly fills up. And for what? Grief teaches nothing. Capitalism cowers pain. I thank you and I look forward to the conversation later on.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Our third and final presenter is Joey De Jesus, who is the author of Hoax, which is forthcoming from the operating system. Knocked, The Threshold of Madness, published by the Atlas Review, and co-author alongside Sade Lene of Writing Voice into the Archive, Volume 1, edited by Jennifer Tamayo with support from UC Berkeley's Center for Race and Gender. Joey received the 2019-20 Brick Art FP Project Room Commission. Joey lives in Ridgewood, where they ran an openly queer abolitionist campaign for New York State Assembly District 38 just this year. Welcome back, Joey.
Hi, hi Paula, thank you. I'm so excited to be back with Poets House. So I was thinking today, I also thank you, Patricia and Bryan. I was taking notes, so I'm kind of like I've lost my place in my mind a little bit. But I wanted to talk really briefly about the campaign because it was such an amazing experience running for state assembly in New York, a district of 130,000 people. While we lost, there were several gains made throughout the course of the campaign and then following the election. Although, you know, it's now been a couple of months and I'm still feeling jaded about the loss. So it's kind of hard to conjure the hope for November, given some of the just mechanics that I've seen and events that have taken place with regard to the ballots and absentee ballots being eliminated or disqualified for absolutely, in my opinion, ludicrous reasons. This past June primary. So I'm just like especially anxious about this upcoming November. Yeah, I want to sort of start with a couple of questions that were sort of fleshing in my mind when I decided to run. I decided to run for office because as Patricia, you know, as we're talking about, we are surrounded by death and, you know, what is this question, like Patricia asked us, you know, what does it mean to tear down these systems? What does it mean to, you know, I'm going to use the word abolish because I think it's really important that we think of this word in this moment. Especially as we, you know, we think we're hearing that the world is sort of coming to an end, or it feels as though the world is coming to an end. And I think it's, as poets, you know, to our imaginations, we can't shy away from what that means. To borrow from Bryan's formulation, like we have to stretch our imaginations. What does it mean to be a poet of world's end? And I think that this for me is has been an important question because I think it's a question of abolition. How do we abolish the systems that that seek to obliterate us, that continue to obliterate us, that we somehow survive, that some of us somehow survive and others of us don't? So I ran because my cousin was a victim of the carceral state. She committed trigger warning, trigger. I lost a cousin to suicide after she had spent over 100 days on Rikers Island. And I decided to look up who it was that represented just who is my state senator, who is my city council person, who is my state assembly person. And as I kind of looked into those figures, I learned about my former opponent, who also lost, thankfully, and we nearly him. A man who voted against equal pay for women. He voted against workplace protections for LGBTQ people. He voted against, right? This is New York. We can't take these things for granted. We can't take that just because someone says they're a Democrat, their political leanings align with ours, right? The man was a declared Democrat. You know, we can't take those things for granted. And I think that that's a question that poetry has really, or a skill that poetry has sort of trained me in, not to take my materials for granted, right? So as a poet, you know, some of my preoccupations are visual arrangements on the page, right? I'm not taking for granted that I'm using Microsoft Word or InDesign, Adobe InDesign to just sort of spatially visual sort of construct a poem on a page, right? Or, you know, I love that Tayimba's book came up. Olio is an amazing book because it's a book that Tayimba's reimagining what the book is as an object. He doesn't take the book as an object for granted. There are pages that open, that accordion out, or that tear out, that you can then sort of warp into shapes. I think these are the sort of like questions that the poets that I find most exciting are engaging in their work. So like, yes, Tayimba, I think, is an extraordinary example of and Olio is an extraordinary example of a poetic intervention of the book as an object, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, like I think that these are the types of experiences and questions that I was sort of like thinking about, because it's practice for, I think, job of an assembly person. Which, you know, I remember getting into a huge debate with one of my opponents who disagreed with what the, you know, role of we disagreed over the term assembly person, because I quite literally or frankly thought this term means, you know, the responsibility of the assembly person is to assemble the people, right? And I think that this is also something that is we have to think about as poets, like, how do we assemble people? Or another way I was thinking about it was with regard to publication. You know, as an adjunct educator and an educator in the CUNY system, everybody talks about publish or die. Well, what is patient, if not the making public of the word? And what are other ways to make our words public as poets? Whether it's on the page, right? Like, which pages do we want to be putting our poems in, right? Because, you know, if the book if you know, as Tayimba just encouraged us to do, like, the book is an expansive thing. He encouraged us to think about the book as an expansive sort of an expanse that it's just expansive. So, you know, I'm going to deliver a poem on the steps of City Hall, and the book are those steps, you know. Or you know, however the metaphor is mixed. So I'm going to just let it fly. But you get what I'm saying. We can't shy away. We shouldn't be, as poets, shying away from other modes of publication, and our words public, and rendering our words public. Yeah, I guess that's like my big point that I want to make. Kind of back though to abolition, before I like close up and read a little poem. I think that some of those named things, that goals that Patricia mentioned, have been set, have been named, right? So with regard to housing and universal housing as a human right, ending homelessness, right? There are a lot of amazing activists in New York who are performing the poetics of naming these these things that have yet to be named, perhaps, or maybe we've yet to hear them, but they're practicing poetry too, right? So like, they may not like that title, but, you know, to say housing is a human right and to advocate for that, I believe, speaks truth to power, and is just, I mean, it's where we are. I don't think that we are in this. I don't think we can arrive at a place where we are surviving without sort of naming anti-settler colonialism or decolonization, abolition, naming these things as like end goals and thinking about that in the same way we think about the climate crisis. Right? You know, what are material steps that we can take? And you know, that can be a form poem, that can be a litany, that can be you know, I think it's a very exciting time for poets to be writing, because the world is ending. and I think abolition is really now kind of up in everybody's face, and I think it's a good thing. So yeah, I'm gonna read. So I was thinking about reading. I have this little quote that, you know, Foucault says, because I was running to be a lawmaker, that unlike poetic constraint, you know, and I'm just gonna riff here because I'm saying that poetic constraints often include rules or take the form of rules. So often, you know, poetic constraint is a rule. Rule codes, though, unlike law, are empty in themselves, violent and unfinalized, and can be bent to any purpose, whereas the law, so he sort of establishes this difference between rules, which are empty and empty, violent, and unfinalized, and law, which is calculated and relentless pleasure, delight in the promise of blood. There's a lot more that we can say about carceral liberalism, and you know, the fact that a lot of people like to think that Trump is the face of fascism, but the governor of New York, also a Democrat, has consolidated power in New York in such a horrifying way that it prevents life-affirming, life-saving measures that can be enacted immediately, and should have been enacted at the onset of the pandemic, but political dalliance has, you know, resulted, of course, in the needless death of 30,000 New Yorkers. Yeah, these are the thoughts that I'm thinking of, and like, I was gonna read this one thing, but I'm gonna read something else. Okay. As fire fell, so did customary truth. City and mountain, sky and oath, we direct our sensorium a goddess depth. Lions move. Asterisms, ugly, unwanted, heart-starter fire, bookkeep to account the loss, vaulting lyrics to colossal haven mid-mastinction. Another red beareth soldiered in disaster's sweat. I crossed out an inventory of angels by process of elimination, deduction my divine weapon. Whiz with abacus, I calculate for revenge journaling cosmologica, falling epithets, every night in the molten months, a star above, writing a salacious poem in me to slander the walls in wisdom about the beads. Not consuming, not capricious, as a despot shaped in the likeness of a maker. Rage spills spelling ruin for the bone vault. Commemorate the wreckage with must mallow, assimilating Saturn's sloat, that abyss where only measure sounds. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and yeah, and that's all I really have to say about it.
Thank you so much, Joey, Patricia, and Bryan. Joey, my condolences again to your late cousin. I remember when you gave one of the most unforgettable performances I've had the honor of hosting at Poets House in last summer in June. You had mentioned your cousin's passing, and it strikes me that in addition to your connection of your poetic practice to your urgency to run for state assembly, I'm also reminded of perhaps a more immediate need, which is a personal one very close to you, and you know, to survive your cousin in this way, and in the process, you were also helping others in your constituency survive in the face of this peril that it's just relentless. So thank you so much for sharing this, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about your run for state assembly. I have a question though, and this is perhaps for you, Joey, and also for Patricia to follow up on. And it's this question of, does politics, which is different from idealism, does actual political work jive with being a poet? And there are, of course, many predecessors of yours, experimental poets, first of all, let's be clear about that, who have found themselves participating in the civic realm. M.A. Césaire, Suzanne Césaire, Pablo Neruda, Lorca, Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, the list goes on, right? But you had also mentioned at the start of your talk that you're feeling jaded, and I'm wondering what the reality of your political experience was like vis-a-vis the reality of being a poet.
At first, it was very difficult to be sort of taken seriously among the other candidates that I ultimately encountered. And I had extreme difficulty with the endorsements process. How well does it jive? I mean, I think that it was difficult because of the pandemic and because I got sick. When it comes to like performing certain tasks as a candidate, vying for endorsements, for instance, my training in poetry actually, and in preparing notes and preparing speeches, public speaking, leading a room, all of that was very, very useful. And in fact, I think people were kind of taken aback by how well I performed in those environments, but that ultimately didn't result in, endorsement or proper endorsements, right? Not until very late in the process was I able to bring those in, or cross endorse and do all of that. I don't necessarily think of that as, that's political work, but there was honestly nothing I could have done to communicate except for cave on my values. My values, of course, being decarceration and the democratization of land and energy through state buybacks and all the policy measures, which can be learned about on the New York State Homes Guarantee and the New York Homes Guarantee website. But I actually thought that poets are quite primed for the work, and like, yeah, I guess that's my immediate sort of thought, because I had the skill.
Yeah. Well, thanks. It just makes me think of the change in poets' participation in the civic realm compared to 2003, for example, in the ramp up to the Iraqi invasion, where post 9/11, in between 9/11 and 2003, where you see so many poets writing poems, publishing poems, really using poetry as a tool to express their dissent, fight in the face of this peril, right? And then this year we have social media, and I see you running for state assembly, and for me this seems unprecedented in many respects, and seems like a sea change in terms of the fact too that your candidacy was supported by poets as well, and you had a lot of poets who were supporting you, giving donations. I'm one of them, and so I think I would like to pivot a bit to Patricia Spears Jones. And Patricia, your work with the American Poets Congress, thinking about Joey's point about the fact that we may be a blue state, but our blueness is all over the place. And what was your experience like organizing poets with presumably so many different versions of what it means to be progressive or liberal or Democrat, for that matter?
Organizing is difficult. And I am not necessarily an organizer, a political organizer of any sort, but all of this came about basically because of another poet, because John King called me up a couple of weeks after Trump won and was screaming on the phone and said, we got to do something. And the next thing I know, I was calling people to say, we got to do something. But in the back of my mind, and it's still very much that, one of the things I want to say about what Joey was doing was that if when you're running for office, you're seeking a serious result. And it is never easy. It's not easy for the people who do it all the time. And it's certainly not easy for someone who is new at it. And clearly, he has an agenda, he has a passion, and I hope he runs again. When he was talking about his run, it just sort of reminded me of something like Joseph Beuys, who ran for office in his native Germany. He didn't win, but he did fairly well. I mean, there all have always been poets and artists who have been interested enough in running for office, in a democracy, if there is one, that it's always kind of great that that actually happens. But what I was thinking about, and I still am thinking about it, is that I really wanted people to start to come to terms with what does it mean to claim to be an American poet? What does it mean to be an American, especially in an anti-immigrant situation right now? I mean, the political situation is ridiculous for migrants in this country, for refugees. People are treated horribly because of both the inability of the far right to clamp completely down, and the utter inability of the supposed liberal left to say, wait a minute, anybody who wants to be an American ought to be an American. So, because the people who came here in the 1890s, they just got off a boat. Nobody said, you can't come here unless, there was syphilic or there, somebody realized they had a criminal record. Every time I hear these people say, my grandfather came here in 18 blah blah, I'm going, yeah, he got on a boat. The rest of us, we were brought here either enslaved or we were bred to be slaves in this country, which is something that people kind of forget. It is very difficult to be an African American woman running anything. I give a great deal of ups to Kamala Harris for running for vice president, because I know for a fact that there are all kinds of people who will not vote for her simply because she is a woman, and B, a Black woman, or a Black and Asian woman, which makes it even more so. It was not easy. It wasn't so much that people had a range of ideas about what it is to be progressive. It was more about whether they would listen and actually follow through on the suggestions that a woman of color made to them. As since I am from Arkansas and we are pretty tough, I just fought it on out. And you have to do that. It is not, none of this is easy. None of it. What Joey just talked about, the presentation part, he can do. It's that backroom shit that's difficult. And it's the gathering of your allies. It's the making sure your language works. It's being diplomatic in one way and like totally like whatever to you in the other. It is not easy, but it has to be done. And I think this is not the time for any of us to shirk our duty as citizens, as human beings, as thinking people who happen to be poets. It is not the time to sort of run and hide under the covers. It doesn't work.
And to your point, Patricia, and also Joey, that while so many people have given the face of fascism Trump's face, the painful truth is that the history of BIPOCs in this country, trans, queer folks, has been apocalyptic from the beginning, right? And this is my pivot to Bryan when I am thinking about what happened with George Floyd and then the wake of George Floyd's murder in Minnesota. And I know you're from Minnesota, that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I wanted to also touch on Joey's point about Cuomo and supposedly Democratic politicians who actually are not democratic in their practice. And I think about de Blasio, who is as liberal as they come, and yet he conducted with Carranza, who's the commissioner, cultural commissioner, this anti-Asian campaign, right? So maybe, Bryan, you could speak specifically to what you've witnessed in Minnesota and the crazy fact that, maybe it's not that crazy that you have a police officer who has a background as a Hmong and a refugee being one of the indicted officers, and speak to this.
Right. I mean, thank you. That's a really challenging question that we're looking at, and we're constantly interrogating ourselves about what happened. And I think as poets, when you've been at this process long enough, you start to understand that there are many times that a story begins, that you have to think back, that you try so hard, like, no, when does the story start? And the reality of it is that a story has many points in time that it starts. And that's the beauty of poetry, that we can actually take a look at that compared to prose. What I find myself thinking about a lot, watching how many of us try to do the immediate first takes when we respond with poetry, examining the George Floyd case, and a curiosity what will emerge over the long term about where we understand that story. It's an important question. I think one of the things that we've noticed as well is also the consideration that while we're still trying to identify who are our true allies, who are our true community members who are open to change and transformation, that much like many of the refugees who faced these issues back in the old countries, is that there may be a time when our poets have to understand the importance of both the overt language and sometimes the covert language, that we may feel some things, but we can't necessarily be as open about it, then while we're still trying to build trust that the right people will see it, will understand it, won't misinterpret us, or at the same time can appreciate those stories. Because I think one of the things that concerns me oftentimes is that within authoritarian systems, you have to understand that what happens is that when they've got all cylinders firing, they will deprive you of a language to express your oppression, but also your opportunities. And poets, we're fallible people, and we have to find our way constantly to pushing our verbiage to the edge of expression, to express the inexpressible. And that is not an easy task. And so this is something that I hope, as we look through the next few decades, Ben, is that sometimes we have to figure out, how do we avoid that paralysis? How do we find the new language that can advocate for system changes? I think it was a profoundly disappointing journey in some ways for many of us, because we can look back to the late 1990s when our communities were coming together with organizations such as Asian American Renaissance or Community Action Against Racism, protesting the media using words and language against us to call us Stone Age people or savages who need to be sent back to our various homes that they think we belong to, even as it ignores the roles that the United States government played in many of us having to become refugees or immigrants in the first place. And so along that line, there's this tragic contradiction that many of us find different paths towards exploring what it means to be an American. And it's like, is that through blind obedience, unquestioning loyalty? Do you become part of authoritarian systems? Do you become part of a system and hope to change it from within? Or do you become part of a silent majority? Do you become a creator then who tries to express an alternative? And so, we're talking a lot about the apocalyptic language then that poets are facing. And I certainly, as the president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association, I certainly point out that that is part of our process, Ben. But what we have to question as we make these apocalyptic poems, Ben, is that how do we signal the warning fires on the one hand of what could happen rationally and irrationally, and at the same time, how do we present these issues so that you take them seriously, or in some cases, then that you undermine the seriousness with which some authoritarians believe that they are going to become your overlords, your new gods and masters in the future that they envision. How do you counter them? How do you put an end to that? So these are challenges that we look within our traditions, and we have to look within our opportunities. The George Floyd case is still an ongoing challenge for so many of us, because we have to take a deep look at ourselves, both on an individual level and as a community. Where do these ideas of anti-Blackness come in? Where do these ideas come in that we've normalized the idea that police can come in and just exert any amount of force then, and that they have presented this image that they are beyond reproach, that we don't have these other systems with which to find redress.
I am reminded in your response and some of Patricia's points to the reality that we all live and pay taxes. Well, most of us pay taxes to the empire of the United States of America, right? And the legacy of American imperialism, a baton passed by British imperialism and the other European histories of imperialism, right? Always looms large over all of us. But it also ties to the not so new reality that has overwhelmed us, which is the pandemic, right? COVID-19. And I'm wondering how each of you individually have responded in your work to this reality. And yeah, maybe something a more simple question like that. How have you been since the pandemic officially broke out? Right. So maybe Joey, we could start with you.
So difficult to answer that question succinctly, just because I had COVID, and so and I was also sick and campaigning from bed, while bedridden for a month. How has it? It's interesting. I'm more in terms of just sitting to write. More attention to my body in different ways now than I think COVID has changed my relationship to writing in an extreme way. One, I think I feel very insular. I feel like I've just been kind of cooped up writing, like almost, like a hermit. Although I have problems with that, right? Like I don't want to be some sort of like, I don't mean to exalt the individual by like, and my individual voice, like as like a hermit. I feel like it can really hinder my writing to be sort of withdrawn from social life. But I also am thinking a lot more about my body, and I've been doing these exercises where I may like start by writing something kind of like grounding techniques. I noticed that like I'm tapping my toe, so I'll just write over and over. I'm tapping my toe and then kind of just follow that movement through my body, or do I guess that's just I think it's in part because I wasn't quite sure if I was gonna, I had COVID pretty bad, and so I felt it felt very grave, and I wasn't even sure, when I first contracted it, that I would still be here today. I would say, like I don't really, it's difficult, right? Because the pandemic was always gonna happen, and I don't know. Sorry, I was just seeing these the comments got me distracted. I guess more embodied.
Okay.
Practices, right?
How about you, Patricia?
I think all of us are thinking about our health and the health of others. And we're thinking about the people who don't give a damn about our health and the health of others. And the one thing that the pandemic has done is make me even angrier than I already was. Um, and one of the things that I've gotten the chance to do for both Black Earth Institute and for Writers Against Trump is to write little mini essays, basically trashing the idiot in power right now, and who is making people's lives even worse by pretending that somehow COVID is just easy to get over because, he's the president. But mostly it was very strange. I wrote maybe between, February and April, one poem, and it's called Lonely Is because I was lonely. And I think the world was lonely. I think the isolation was difficult, but also incredibly useful. I think maybe one of the things that was the best thing about this. I mean, get the horrors of the actual death, illness and death, was the fact that people had to, and the planet in a way had to take a pause. And because of that, there were more birds in the world. There were more animals running around. It was like they were like, no people, thank goodness, so it made me realize how disruptive human beings are to all kinds of manner of beast and crops and plants and whatever. We really need to rethink how we are to live on this planet, how we are to be. What does health actually mean? Is what I kept thinking. What does health mean? Because we live in a country where an inordinate amount of people seem to not care about their own physical health, their family's health, the health of their community, the health of the planet. And that is horrific. That's what I've been thinking about.
Thanks for that, Patricia. I'm thinking personally, before I turn over to Bryan, my own family's sense of feeling imperiled post-pandemic with the xenophobia that has spiked, but also, Trump calling this the China virus, and then the really invisible reality of tenants, business owners in the ethnic ghettos of Chinatown across the city and around the country, right? Who are suffering 6 times worse economically than most folks. And I'm wondering, Bryan, what your experience has been like being a person of Asian descent and an immigrant like myself in Minnesota. How has it been for you post-pandemic?
Well, I have to admit, it's paradoxical. There are a lot of these challenges then that as we're facing anti-Asian racism left and right, and Asian American communities, in particular Asian American refugees, are often being pushed into a system where we're being asked to make very clear and conscious choices about where our allegiances lie. Sometimes they're easily given, and other times it's conflicted. I think a lot about it because when we're talking about the Asian American refugee experience, we often have this joke that other Americans always live in this fear of the apocalypse, but in the aftermath of the Vietnam War 45 years ago, we already had our apocalypse in Cambodia, in Laos, in Vietnam. And coming here, the expectation some people seem to have had of us is that, we'll resettle, we will rebuild, we'll get that nice little house in the suburbs, 2.5 kids and a white picket fence, and then we'll leave behind and we'll give up all the skills that helped us to survive so long. And all these strategies there that I saw it in firsthand in many of the households there where the younger generation had already begun to feel like mom and dad, grandma and grandpa were over preparing, or that we live in America. You don't have to act like the shoe is going to drop, or that this crisis is going to happen. That we live in the land of plenty, then. And I think that as a poet, I'm always interested in what some of my other colleagues and I had always discussed about. Our task is to see the truth of the uncertainty and the chaos of the cosmos. Then that you're going to have any number of unexpected events happen in your lifetime. Then how do you not be paralyzed by that? If as a poet, you can't express your way through that. And to find a way to share that information, that knowledge, those ideas with others, then it's like if we can't do that, then what hope do those who don't have art, who don't have poetry in their lives, have? I mean, for me, the COVID experience has been a challenge, and one I was actually scheduled to do several exhibits throughout the course of 2020, then, because I had to already anticipate that. It's very hard to get refugee stories, immigrant stories into the bookstores and to do these performances. And yet I find myself saying, no, study the lives of poets of the Tang Dynasty, study the lives of the poets of post-war Japan, or had any of the other Asian experiences in which conflict and natural disasters have been a part of that experience. And you can find deep comfort in that, but you don't know what's going to happen, but you do see people who try to express an intent and a sense of purpose to survive, to pass something on to a next generation, and I think that's ideal.
Let me actually also say, Joey, I'm so happy to see you, that you're okay as a poet who survived COVID, and just to see you be a part of this program is really inspiring for myself, and I'm sure everyone watching this. Alas, this conversation can only be an initial one. We are out of time, but I wanted to make sure that I made some time to ask what is next for each of you. So perhaps we could start with you, Joey. What's next? What can we look forward to on your end?
So on my end, I'm teaching a workshop with the Liminal Labs on unsettling third world, with the little parentheses around the L, starting next second week of October, so I guess next week. And I'm gonna be involved in the city council races in New York. So next June is the city council races. Most city council members are termed out. This is an extremely important election with so many seats up. And I think, if my campaign served for anything, it shows that people can run for office. And so there are many candidates running for city council all across the city. This is extremely important. We have four borough-based jails forthcoming to the city that the city is sinking billions of dollars into. And quite a lot more. So I'll be volunteering with Sandy and Alida Gagarin, and there are several other amazing candidates who are abolitionists, who are fighting for universal health care and housing and universal suffrage, among other really, really, really important issues. So I'm gonna propagandize around them. I'm just gonna deploy the word and make that have city council people who are going to fight for us. So that's like, that, and then yeah, that's pretty much it.
Great. How about you, Patricia?
What's forthcoming? I am working on the second draft of a new collection, which I hope will be published by 2022. I am working with a variety of organizations to help remove the person who is currently working out of the White House. I hope that we will be able to rethink what the American Poets Congress can be and maybe actually have one next year. And I am working like everybody else on trying to stay healthy and to help others stay healthy as we go forward. That's what I'm doing.
And Bryan, I understand that you're in Detroit right now, and you seem to be always on the go. What's next for you?
Well, I have to admit that's actually part of my new process here. I'm looking for things to surprise me as well as a poet, and it may sound modest, I suppose, is that as always we're writing, we're creating, we're looking at new books that we can create. Even though I just finished releasing my first book after 7 years in print, I'm always experimenting with something new to try out. And I think probably the other thing that I'm just going to be focusing on in the near future is helping other people finish their books, and to try and talk with my wonderful cohort of students then, helping them make that journey from caterpillars into the kind of butterflies who can create storms that change the world. So you'll see the results soon enough, I assure you.
Rest assured, to our national, international audience, Bryan, Patricia, and Joey are continuing their transformation of their students' minds and hearts. I'm very much grateful for your participation today. And as for our audience tonight, as ever, be safe, be kind, be generous, and please, please register to vote. And until next time, be safe.
If you've enjoyed these programs, please consider giving a contribution to Poets House. For more than 30 years, they've kept the door wide open to everyone for the joy of poetry. Recently, they have temporarily had to shut the door and are reeling from the financial implications. Please give, even a small donation if you can. Thank you.